Hey everyone, and welcome back to Study Hall. We're diving into something today that's been getting a lot of attention lately, a new executive order, and it's all about tackling anti-Semitism, especially on college campuses.
Yeah, it's a really complicated issue with a lot of different perspectives.
For sure. To break it all down, we've got a couple of key sources with us today.
Okay.
First, we've got excerpts from the actual executive order itself,
Right.
signed January 29th, 2025.
Okay.
And then we've got this analysis that lays out some of the potential pros and cons, different viewpoints. So the big question we're tackling today is, how is this executive order trying to deal with anti-Semitism?
Yeah.
And what are some of the possible implications, both the intended ones and maybe some unintended consequences too?
I think it's really important to understand the context surrounding this order. The administration is saying there's been a surge in anti-Semitism, especially since the Hamas attacks back in October of 2023.
Right. That seems to be a big factor behind this.
Yeah, a key driver, for sure.
And the order itself says its purpose is to really strongly combat anti-Semitism using whatever legal tools are available. It even specifically connects this effort to what they're seeing as an increase in anti-Semitic incidents
Right.
since those attacks on October 7th.
Yeah. And this new order actually builds upon an earlier one, Executive Order 13 AC 99, which was signed back in 2019.
Okay.
And, that one was also aimed at combating anti-Semitism. But here's the interesting part.
Okay.
The current administration is basically saying that this previous order was rendered ineffective by the policies of the previous administration.
So it sounds like there's a real sense of urgency.
Definitely.
A feeling that something needs to be done and done forcefully. But how does this new order plan to actually do that?
Right.
What specific actions are we talking about?
Well, it lays out a number of key provisions. One of them requires all these different government agencies to report on the existing tools for fighting anti-Semitism,
Okay.
but also potential new tools. So it's like taking an inventory.
Okay, so it's like taking stock of what's already out there.
Exactly. What's being done? What else could be done?
What resources and strategies are already in place.
And the order also mandates an inventory and analysis of all the pending complaints and court cases related to anti-Semitism on campuses. So they're really trying to get a clearer picture of how widespread the problem is and are there any systemic issues.
Makes sense.
And then to give this effort some real teeth, the order encourages the Attorney General to actually utilize specific legal frameworks for prosecution.
Okay.
Like, for example, a statute called 18 U.S.C. 241.
And just to clarify for our listeners, that particular statute deals with conspiracies to deprive individuals of their civil rights.
Exactly. So they're signaling a commitment to pursuing legal action against people who engage in anti-Semitic acts. But then there's another part of this that's potentially the most impactful and I'd say also the most controversial.
Okay.
It's this directive to monitor the activities of international students and staff. That could potentially even lead to deportation. And the order actually cites a specific section of the U.S. Code as justification.
Okay.
8 U.S.C. 1182(3).
Okay, now that section of the legal code can get pretty dense and technical. So to put it simply for our listeners, it basically outlines the grounds for not being allowed into the United States.
Right.
It's a broad category. It covers things like security threats, public health concerns.
Right, and that's where the controversy comes in. How will this be interpreted and applied when we're talking about anti-Semitism? What specific activities would trigger someone being reported under this provision?
Yeah.
And could that potentially lead to deportation? These are really tough questions.
It definitely raises some serious questions.
Yeah.
So let's put this to you, our listeners. If you were in charge of figuring out what kinds of activities should be reported, where would you draw the line? Imagine this scenario. An international student expresses really strong criticism of Israeli policies. Would that be enough to report them? Where does protected free speech end? And where does activity that could lead to deportation begin? It's a tough one.
Yeah, really tough one.
It is.
Yeah, it is a really difficult question. And it gets to the core of, the challenge of defining and addressing anti-Semitism. Because on the one hand, there's this real need to protect Jewish students from harassment and discrimination, but we also have to be super careful about protecting First Amendment rights.
Exactly. That's the tension that the analysis we're looking at highlights. It specifically talks about this potential clash between those two things, protecting Jewish students and upholding free speech.
Yeah, and it's a very real concern. You can imagine situations where criticism of Israeli policies is either like intentionally misrepresented as anti-Semitism or even just accidentally misinterpreted.
Uh,
And if people on campus, especially international students, are afraid to speak their minds because they're worried about being reported or punished, that can really stifle open discussion and debate.
mhm. The analysis also points out some other potential issues with this order, like it mentions these vague enforcement mechanisms.
Right. The order tells all these different agencies to take action.
Hmm.
But it doesn't really give much guidance about how they'll determine if there's been a violation or what the consequences would be.
Right. It doesn't really clearly define what anti-Semitism means in practice.
Mm,
So will there be like a consistent standard?
exactly. Or could it be up to different people at different institutions to decide?
Right. That lack of clarity could definitely lead to inconsistencies and biases in how the order is applied.
For sure. And that leads us to another concern, that the analysis raises the potential for selective enforcement. The order is specifically focused on anti-Semitism,
Right.
but it doesn't offer similar protections to other groups who might be experiencing discrimination.
That's a really important point.
Yeah, and while the goal of fighting anti-Semitism is obviously a good thing, focusing on one form of discrimination without addressing others,
Yeah.
that could create this perception of unequal treatment. It could even lead to accusations that the order is being used to silence certain groups or target certain viewpoints while ignoring others.
So it seems like we're seeing a combination of potential benefits from this order, but also some real concerns about how it might actually be put into practice and what the unintended consequences could be. It
Exactly.
sounds like the details of how it's implemented are going to be super important.
Oh, absolutely. The success of this order and its long-term impact will depend heavily on how it's actually translated into concrete actions. So clear definitions, transparent enforcement mechanisms, safeguards to protect constitutional rights, all of that's going to be crucial. If those things aren't in place, we really risk creating more problems than we solve.
And it's also important to remember that this order is probably just the beginning of a much bigger conversation.
Right.
It's going to be debated and challenged and refined as we try to work through all these complex issues.
And that's where you, our listeners, come in. This is a conversation that needs thoughtful engagement from all of us. We've covered a lot of ground today, but we've only scratched the surface of this really important topic. And we want to encourage you to keep digging into it, keep asking questions, and keep the conversation going.
Because knowledge is most powerful when it's understood and applied. So what are your thoughts? How can we effectively fight anti-Semitism while also upholding the values of free speech and equality for everyone?
We talked about the potential dangers of chilling free speech on campus, but I think it's important to acknowledge that there can also be real consequences when hate speech is allowed to flourish unchecked. It can create a hostile environment that makes it difficult for students to learn and thrive. It can even contribute to a climate of fear and intimidation.
That's a really important point.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we find that balance? How do we create an environment on campus where everyone feels safe and respected, where diverse viewpoints can be expressed freely, but where hate speech is not tolerated?
It's a tough question, and there's no easy answer. But I think it starts with open and honest dialogue. We need to be able to have those tough conversations about these issues without resorting to name-calling or shutting down opposing viewpoints.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's also important to recognize that there are different forms of anti-Semitism. It's not always overt or explicitly hateful.
Right.
Sometimes it can be more subtle, like microaggressions or perpetuating harmful stereotypes.
Exactly. And we need to be able to identify and address those more subtle forms, too. It's not just about punishing these really obvious acts of hate. It's about creating a culture of respect and understanding where all students feel valued and included.
So if we think about this in the context of this executive order, it seems like one of the key challenges is going to be how to actually define anti-Semitism in a way that captures the nuances of the issue,
Right.
but also provides some clear guidelines for how to enforce it.
Exactly. We need a definition that's both broad enough to encompass the many forms that anti-Semitism can take, but also specific enough that it's not misused to suppress legitimate criticism of Israeli policies or stifle free speech.
This kind of brings us back to one of the provisions in the order, the one that encourages the Attorney General to use existing legal frameworks for prosecution.
Yeah.
One of the statutes mentioned is 18 U.S.C. 241, which, as we discussed earlier, deals with conspiracies to deprive individuals of their civil rights. Do you think that's an appropriate legal tool to use for addressing anti-Semitism on campus?
It's potentially a powerful tool, but it also raises some concerns. 18 U.S.C. 241 is a very broad statute, and it's typically used to prosecute more serious crimes like hate crimes that involve violence or the threat of violence.
Mm.
It's not really clear how it would be applied in cases of, say, verbal harassment or online hate speech.
And there's also the question of whether using criminal law to address anti-Semitism on campus is even the most effective approach. Some people argue that it could actually have a chilling effect on free speech and create a climate of fear and mistrust. Others say it's necessary to really send a strong message that anti-Semitism won't be tolerated.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I think it's a complex issue with valid arguments on both sides. On the one hand, I understand the desire to use every tool available to combat anti-Semitism, especially given the recent rise in incidents. But on the other hand, I do have concerns about the potential for overreach and the impact on free speech. So I think it's important to explore other approaches as well. Things like education and awareness campaigns, restorative justice programs, and efforts to foster dialogue and understanding across different communities.
It makes sense. I mean, a multifaceted problem like this probably requires a multifaceted approach.
Absolutely. There's no magic solution here. It's
Yeah.
going to require a combination of strategies that are tailored to the specific context of each campus and the needs of the community.
So we've talked about the potential benefits and drawbacks of this executive order, the challenges of defining and addressing anti-Semitism, and the importance of balancing free speech with the need to create a safe and inclusive environment for everyone on campus. But there's another piece of this that we haven't really talked about yet, the role of universities themselves.
Yeah, you're right. Universities have this crucial role to play in shaping campus culture and responding to incidents of anti-Semitism. They have a responsibility to create a climate where all students feel welcome and supported, and to take swift and decisive action when those values are violated.
And that can be a really tricky balance.
They care.
Universities are often hesitant to be seen as policing speech or thought, especially given how much emphasis there is on academic freedom.
Right.
But they also have this obligation to protect your students from discrimination and harassment.
Exactly. And that's where having clear policies and procedures is essential. Universities need to have really well-defined definitions of anti-Semitism, transparent processes for reporting and investigating incidents, and fair and equitable sanctions for anyone who's found responsible for engaging in discriminatory behavior. And they also need to provide strong support services for students who have been targeted by anti-Semitism, things like counseling, advocacy, and legal assistance.
So it sounds like universities need to be proactive, not just reactive.
Absolutely. It's not enough to just respond to incidents after they've already happened. Universities need to be actively working to create a campus culture that's inclusive and respectful of all students. And this could include things like mandatory diversity and inclusion training for faculty and staff, developing educational programs about anti-Semitism and other forms of discrimination, and fostering partnerships with student groups and community organizations that are working to promote interfaith dialogue and understanding.
This brings us back to the international student provision in the executive order. Universities are often tasked with monitoring the activities of international students to make sure they're complying with visa requirements. Do you think this new order will make that role more complicated, especially given the concerns we've been talking about overreach and the potential for chilling free speech?
It's definitely something that universities are going to have to navigate very carefully. The order doesn't give much concrete guidance on how this monitoring should actually be carried out or what kinds of activities should trigger reporting. And that lack of clarity could lead to inconsistencies in how it's implemented and potentially create a climate of fear and uncertainty among international students.
And it's worth noting that international students already face a lot of challenges and barriers when they're navigating the U.S. higher education system. They often have to deal with language barriers, cultural differences, and these really complex immigration regulations. Adding this extra layer of scrutiny could make those challenges even harder and make it even more difficult for them to feel welcome and integrated into campus life.
Yeah, I think universities are going to need to be especially mindful of the potential impact on international students and take steps to try to mitigate any negative consequences. And this could include things like providing really clear and accurate information about the order and what it means, offering legal support and advocacy services, and creating safe spaces for students to express their concerns and share their experiences.
So it seems like this executive order has the potential to significantly impact the relationship between universities and their international student populations.
Oh, without a doubt. It adds this whole new layer of complexity to an already complex issue. And it'll be interesting to see how universities respond in the coming months and years.
As we're talking about all of this, it makes me think about the historical context of anti-Semitism, especially on college campuses. Like, this isn't a new problem, unfortunately.
You're absolutely right. Throughout history, Universities have kind of been at the forefront of both positive social change, but also sometimes the continuation of harmful prejudices and anti-Semitism has sadly been a recurring issue.
Yeah, and it's something to keep in mind as we try to figure out these challenges today. We can learn from past successes and failures, and hopefully avoid repeating some of the mistakes.
I agree. For example, there have been times in the past when universities have had policies or practices that were discriminatory towards Jewish students, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. We have to be careful to make sure that this new executive order, while it's trying to combat anti-Semitism, doesn't accidentally create new forms of exclusion or discrimination.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it just emphasizes how important it is to really carefully implement this order and keep a close eye on it. We've talked a lot about the potential downsides and challenges, but it's also important to say that this order could have some positive impacts too.
Right.
It could raise awareness about anti-Semitism, encourage universities to be more proactive about addressing it, and maybe even provide some additional resources and legal tools to actually combat it.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point.
The
The increased attention and scrutiny could lead to some positive changes, but it's super important that those changes are made in a way that protects everyone's rights and doesn't create new problems in the process.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's where the specifics are so important. How this order is interpreted and actually used on the ground will be critical. It's going to take a lot of careful thought, a discussion, and a commitment to finding solutions that address anti-Semitism while also protecting the rights of everyone in the campus community.
Well, this deep dive has given us all a lot to think about. We've explored this really complex issue, and there are definitely no easy answers. But hopefully it's made you, our listeners, think a little deeper about these questions and start having these conversations in your own communities.
Remember, learning is a journey. Keep those minds sharp and keep asking those tough questions. We'll see you back here in Study Hall soon.